So we're recording. We're here with Philip. How are you doing today, Philip?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thanks for
Awesome.
having me on.
Yes, you've written a satirical article. Your Substack is called "Everything is Priced In," and the article is "Price Gouging Should Be Mandatory: A Case for Price Controls." So I think before Kamala Harris came out with this, public policy statement saying she was going to limit price gouging on groceries, I think most Americans have never really heard. I mean, certainly I have never heard. It's now after she made that statement, a lot of Democrats came out and defended her and said that, actually there are already laws on the book. Today, even despite the Reagan Revolution, there are still laws in the book that allow for restrictions on price gouging, which are effective price controls. I think we've all heard of rent controls. Actually, there's a fascinating example. The last heir of the Ottoman dynasty moved to New York City with his wife and got a rent-controlled apartment that they lived in till they were in their 90s. And the rent, I think they died probably in the 2000s, and the rent was $300 a month for this like glorious New York apartment because it was a rent-controlled apartment. So yeah, definitely there are rent controls that people have heard about, but no one's really. I mean, I've never heard of outside of that price controls, even if there are these state level legislations. But in terms of federal, this seems somewhat unprecedented for my generation. Now, going back to FDR, that actually was something that was. Existing. I'm more familiar with like the agricultural controls where he was paying farmers to burn their crops. And I think some of that still goes on to an extent, at least in subsidies. So there is a lot of intervention in the market that goes on. But like the way that Kamala was just directly, almost vote buying in a more bold way of saying like I'm going to make it illegal for groceries to be expensive. Like that's pretty bold. I'm sort of cynical, maybe in a good way, or I'm just skeptical that she would implement that policy because Joe Biden made a similar appeal with student loans and he was unsuccessful at getting that through. So I think there's a percent chance that Kamala says, well, I'm probably not going to be able to implement that. It's probably going to be struck down by the courts, so we don't really have to worry about it anyways. It's just appealing to voters. I think even if it did go through, it would be for a short duration, and so it might mess with the market for 6 months or something, but then she would declare the crisis over, and it would go away and back to normal. With all of that being said as an introduction, do you think what I've said so far is fair, or would you criticize that and say there's a different picture?
Yeah, I discussed this a little bit in my article. So I think the idea is that, it's a little bit of a Mott and Bailey where, like, Kamala comes out and she's like, oh, we're going to fight the corporate greed or whatever, and talk about like all these interventions that have been tried in the past and haven't worked. If you want to look at the history with the Nixon administration, they actually did a lot of stuff that they either, immediately rolled back or had a lot of negative effects. But then, of course, like all the Krugman technocratic types come on and just say like, no, 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 it's not price controls like that. It's sort of like federalizing, or I don't know, doing something with these price gouging laws, which are supposed to only apply to like these certain like emergency situations. And like you can see, like I included like a video of like Elizabeth Warren doing exactly this, except I think she sort of gave away the game by sort of trading on the Mott and Bailey in the middle of the same interview. And so she sort of got called out for that. But basically the idea is like you have this sort of populist rhetoric where like you talk about like fighting corporate greed or whatever, and then like if anyone actually calls you out on it, you can just say like, no, we're just gonna like do this like do this small thing that only applies in certain contexts or like emergencies and stuff. And so my article was actually about those. It's sort of taken as given what you're saying, that like a lot of what Kamala is saying is this populist rhetoric that isn't going to be implemented or is going to be like super small scale or something. But even so, I think that a lot of the laws that are on the books are at best doing nothing, and probably slightly harmful in some situations.
Yeah, I mean, one way would be she could say if, if grocery prices overall go up, like if the price of eggs increases by 10%, within within 1 week, well, it'll activate this law, and then we'll introduce a price ceiling. It's like, well, that probably won't happen, but it's it is populist rhetoric, to say, well, if theoretically something did happen, we would put a stop to it. And we actually did have an egg shortage in this country. I don't remember exactly when it was, but I remember, people complaining about it and going to the store and saying, "Where's the eggs?" And the people say, "Oh, wait, nobody has any eggs." So yeah, shortages happen. Um, Prices sometimes go up in short amount of time. I don't. Yeah, I'm not, I guess, super interested in like doing the Krugman or Warren, because they're part of a political apparatus that's trying to win an election. So they're going to say things that are stretching the truth or rhetorical, or basically they're engaging in a form of apologetics, for something that, at the end of the day is maybe silly, or like you said, it's either going to it's either going to be super invasive in the market and maybe have unintended consequences, or it's just not even going to happen at all. And so why are we even talking about it? So yeah, it's I guess, maybe, can we go into a little bit of the history of this? I mean, my opinion or my understanding is that FDR was the first to implement, price controls, and you mentioned that there were even price controls under Richard Nixon, which is, I guess, makes sense from the perspective that it was Reagan who introduced a lot of the free market reforms. And also, okay, can you tell me a little bit about, Krugman specifically, because I think you know more about him. What was he a part of the like Reaganite, Thatcherite sort of Ayn Rand circle, back in, like, I don't know, the 80s or 90s, on the more libertarian side? Now he's in favor of these price controls. Is that true?
I don't know what he was doing in the 80s. So, like in the 90s, like he was like a superstar, like academic economist, like pumping out like really good journal articles, basically that are like basically of only of like sort of interest to other academic economists, but like on that level, he was like a true like superstar, like top 10 in the world, basically. Um, and then it sort of just, I guess he got this like New York Times stuff, and he's basically become a political pundit, which I guess is fine. Like I don't share his political views, but he's basically like a mainstream. He basically went from like mainstream neoclassical economist who was like working within that academic framework and like being super successful at that to like now mainstream democratic pundit. And then his view on price controls is basically like, the laws we have on the books are basically fine. And Kamala is basically like, if she does anything, they will look exactly like that. What I found particularly galling was like, he's not even recognizing like the sort of campaign maneuvers that Kamala is doing, and he's like chastising people for being like worried. So like Kamala comes out and she's like, "Oh, we're gonna fight corporate greed and introduce price controls," and like this is if people took that seriously, then I think people have the right to be worried about that because anytime you introduce like severe price controls on an economy, there's going to be, in my opinion, there's going to be like really bad consequences of that. And so Krugman's like trading on that as well by saying like, "Oh, look at these idiot rubes on the right who are like taking Kamala at her word." And it's like, come on, man, like what she's doing. You don't have to insult people for being worried about it. If your thesis is that she's not going to do anything, then just say that.
Um, how seriously do you take the field of economics? Do you think that economists, like, I'm guessing you're kind of sympathetic to Austrian economists. Do you feel like, I think I don't remember if it was von Mises who was supposed to have predicted the 1929 recession or depression, I should say. Um, do you think that within the field of Austrian economics that they're able to make reasonable predictions about the future? On the same level that we would expect like a chemist to anticipate the results of a chemical reaction, or a meteorologist should be able to predict the weather. A physicist should be able to predict like how far a cannonball will go. How would you compare economics as a field to these other areas, and kind of limit it? Maybe you disagree with Krugman or something, but like within the scope of your favorite economists, do you think economics is on par with any other field? Like what percent? What's the kind of overall, if you had to put a number on it, kind of like the percent accuracy of economics as a field compared to, like, if we say like physics is 100% or something, and I don't know, biologists might have, this is at scale, of course. Biologists have like a, you know, 90%. Is economics like 80%? Is it 1%? How rigorous do you think it is as a field?
Well, first of all, I don't really accept a lot of what Austrians do. Like, I'm a libertarian, so I'm sympathetic to their worldview, but as an academic discipline, I don't think a lot of them what they did was right. I think like what Rothbard did was really cool, and he opened up a lot of people to sort of a different framework for understanding things. But like, if you just go through the stuff, like I think just mainstream neoclassical economics is better. And basically, anything that the Austrians did that was like good or improved on like neoclassical theory has basically been incorporated now. Maybe a little bit under the rug, because I don't think people like to give Austrians any credit for doing anything of value. But you know, I think basically I buy like the neoclassical Kool-Aid, so to speak, and I think if you want to think about economics seriously, I think that's the right framework to think about it. I think Austrian stuff is cool, and I also hate the state, but yeah, as a technical discipline, I don't think it's the right way to proceed. In terms of like economics as a discipline, obviously, it's not like physics or chemistry. So if you want to think about like rigor or like what we know, I don't know. I can't assign a number, but it's like way below, right? But this is sort of a problem for all social science, and especially stuff in which you can't do experiments, right? So the big problem for economics is we don't have controlled settings across which we can induce variation and like variables of interest, right? So everything we do, almost everything. I mean, there's a burgeoning field of like random where people like go to Africa and just like basically do these experiments that are maybe more difficult to do in the first world, but basically everything we do is just going to be derived from observation. And when you only have observation rather than experimentation, it's very hard to like figure out causal effects. And especially when it comes to human behavior, it's complicated, right? And so I think economics is behind hard sciences, but I don't think that's a failure of economists. I think that's just the nature of the field, right? I think when you don't have access to experimentation and you can't evaluate counterfactuals in that way, you're always going to be at a struggle. And I think the advances we have made, theory in conjunction with like some novel empirical techniques, I think it's certainly a discipline worth doing.
Yeah, I agree with you that social science is at a disadvantage. Um, like psychology, for example, seemingly would be easier or harder. I mean, so there's a question here of, like, I'll give you an example from biology. If you take a particular cat and you ask a biologist, like, what will this cat do in the next 5 minutes? The biologist isn't going to have great predictive power. But if you have a population of cats and you say like, well, can you study this population of cats and then tell me over the course of next year whether you think the population is going to expand or contract? The biologist probably is going to have greater accuracy. So, um, so yeah, there's an argument to be made that because human society is so big and it's hard to contain, there's so many different variables, it's hard to control for all the variables, it's hard to figure out what does what. Okay, yes, there's economic policy, and then there's also, I don't there's so many things here. There's technology. What's the impact of technology? What's the impact? You reference Noah Smith, and I want to get into this concept of greedflation. Um, but yeah, I guess that's so. There's like three kind of comments / questions I have, or I'd like to get your take on any of them. And the first one is kind of like when we say that social sciences aren't easy to do as hard sciences, or they're not as predictive, I think everyone agrees with that. But then you take something like psychology, which theoretically is only you could technically study one person at a time, versus economics where you have to study like the entire globe simultaneously, and you can't really disaggregate countries because they're all connected with trade. Um, I guess, would you expect psychology to be more predictive than economics for that reason? I'm kind of more sympathetic to the view based off how we do biology and how biologists are more predictive at the group level rather than the individual level. And the when I talk to people about the field of psychology, one of the fields that sometimes stands out as better than the others or as more predictive than the others is psychometrics. And so psychometrics is an example, I think, within psychology where studying an individual person, like knowing the IQ or the personality traits of one person, is not as predictive as looking at a group level of saying, okay, well, we have a large group of people with this IQ or these personality traits, and therefore, we have much greater certainty about the probability of certain life outcomes than if we were to just look at an individual. So that's kind of my position on economics, that it actually should be more predictive than like individual psychological assessment, because it's dealing with, like, the larger the system gets, the more closely it's going to conform to, I don't know, laws of averages and things like that. In the same way, I'll make another metaphor to physics where it's extremely difficult to figure out maybe what an individual quantum particle is going to do, if it's impossible. But if you have a lot of atoms together in a cannonball, then, I almost said physicians, but physicists can more accurately tell you what the cannonball is going to do as a composite of billions or trillions of atoms than it can tell you what any individual quantum particle is going to do. So I guess from a theoretical basis, I feel like economics should be possible, but I guess I feel like among the social sciences it should be the most predictive, but I haven't seen a lot of clear evidence for that. I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but I also wanted to ask you, when you say classical or neoclassical economics, I'm not sure if that's the term you use. I'm not super familiar with that. I know, like, Adam Smith and Ricardo, or Ricardo, sorry.
Ricardo, yeah.
I've heard of those guys. Who is among this neoclassical group? Is that prior to Austrian economics? Is that simultaneous after them? Who are those people? Like, what are the big names?
Sure. When I said neoclassical, I just meant like representative of, mainstream economic thinking that you will be taught if you take it in college, and, that sort of dominates the framework of how academic economists think about problems. So I don't know if there's like a big, like, it's basically everyone, right? From, Adam Smith through Ricardo, through like Keynes and Friedman, and like Keynes is sort of not neoclassical, but there was later on there was like the the neoclassical Keynesian synthesis, and sort of now everybody sort of thinks the same way, more or less. Like there's still debates, but it's not like there's these two big schools anymore. And then outside of neoclassical, there's like heterodox stuff. So there's like Austrian, there's like modern monetary theory, there's like Marxism, of course, and so that's what I'm saying. Neoclassical, in contrast to heterodox stuff that you wouldn't be taught at college, basically.
I feel like I'm hearing about the history of the Catholic Church right now.
Yeah, no, like you so if you just go on Wikipedia and just follow like, so there was neoclassical and then Keynesian, and then it goes to new classical, and I forget the exact titles, and then goes to new Keynesian, and then there's the new synthesis. There was one synthesis and then a second synthesis. So yeah, it is sort of like that, where there's these two competing schools, and there's like ecumenical thought and all this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, like in other science, or even, yeah, I mean, in biology, maybe we could say, like, okay, there's Darwinism and there's Lamarckianism, and then you would say, like, the study of epigenetics is kind of somewhere in
Yeah.
between those two, where it's not like the environment has an ability to directly influence genetics and so on. Um, yeah, I just that's an interesting parallel, especially when we're talking about economic theories that I sometimes I struggle to see the influence of these things. Like I struggle. Sometimes I talk to libertarians and they say like, well, the government does this thing and it says that the only way we can, like for instance with prices, right? So the government or like a statist will come in and say, in order to lower prices, the best and the easiest way to do that is to introduce price controls. And then a libertarian will say, no, actually, if you really wanted to lower prices, what you would do is you would reduce regulation and you would open up free trade, and then you would reduce these inefficiencies in the market, and that would give you the lowest price that's possible, because otherwise you're just going to, what you're doing is you're lowering the price, but in doing so you're introducing inefficiencies into the market that create hidden costs elsewhere, and so you haven't actually reduced the price. But in both of these cases, there are people trying to theoretically approach this question of how do we reduce the price, how do we make society better, and it's not. I mean, I guess like there are big broad arguments to be made that say that the Soviet Union had a drastically different economic system, and America has a better economic system, or even more specifically, say like East and West Germany. Like East Germany had a worse economic system, West Germany had a better one, and so that accounts for this difference. But you can actually go back like hundreds of years prior to communism, and you can find that there were these differences in wealth between what we would term, geographically East and West Germany, going back hundreds of years. Similarly, there have been, Russia has lagged behind the West for hundreds of years, before communism. So, I mean, probably the best example would be something like North and South Korea. But I look at that and I say, yes, North Korea is very poor. It does very badly. But is that because communism is a terrible system? I mean, maybe that could be part of the explanation. But I also think it's because they have a Spartan society where like 10% of their population is active duty military, and they're under all these sanctions, which if they weren't under those sanctions, they'd probably be wealthier, if they didn't maintain such a large military apparatus. Like they're a very small country that has nuclear weapons, which is takes up a lot of their GDP, their nuclear weapons program. So, like, if they could just be a peaceful society that didn't have such a, like Iceland or something, where they don't have a huge overbloated military, they're not redirecting all this wealth to their military. It seems to me that North Korea would be a lot richer and prosperous and have less poverty if that was the case. So, I guess these are kind of where I get skeptical of the idea that I guess I see communism as proceeding from, in effective terms, like we can disagree about obviously Karl Marx had his own concept of what Marxism was, but effectively what I see communism as being is a way for a state to massively overinvest in defensive or offensive military resources in circumstances that otherwise are untenable. So like when Mao decided to forcibly industrialize the country, he caused all of these famines, and then he instituted the one-child policy that caused fertility to plummet. And both of those things, like from a libertarian perspective, you could say were extremely costly and not worth doing. And I'm happy for people to assert that, but also I'm skeptical that through without that kind of coercive intervention, that the Soviet Union could have industrialized as quickly as it did, or that China could have industrialized as quickly as it did. If there was no one-child policy, sure, countries' fertility has decreased with increasing development. But in China, it was kind of the opposite. They instituted the policy before China started developing, and it kind of inverted the relationship there. So I guess that's my soft, defensive of communism. Not that there are no externalities. Obviously, you do get shortages, you get bread lines, you get famines, you get all these bad things, and so I'm not going to say there aren't bad results to that, but I guess I view it as a particular approach. So yeah, Kamala's approach here, she's not going full communism. She's not saying, we have to fight China, and so we have to reindustrialize America with my 5-year plan. But I might be in favor of that. I don't know. So I guess these are kind of my sympathies toward state intervention, is mostly having to do with the survival of the state, foreign policy, the fact that if we kind of lay back and we don't intervene at certain points, maybe that makes sense from the perspective of the consumer. Obviously wants to have the lowest prices possible, and I guess this isn't any defense. This isn't actually really relevant to where we started with Kamala's specific policies. I guess a better policy to talk about would be the trying to relieve student loan debt. I think there's a stronger argument to be made that making education free or affordable, there's basically a state-based or almost military argument for having the population consolidated into a university system, into an education system, for the purposes of national unity, national defense, national interest. Whereas, yeah, the place where we started is kind of myopic and silly, but I want to maybe see if we can turn it in a more serious direction.
Well, about communism, I am amenable to the view that there's more to life than consumption, and I don't think GDP is the be all and end all, right? So just as a thought experiment, right? You could imagine a society of people who just really like leisure, and so they're very productive, but they don't have a high GDP per capita because they just like to not work that much. That doesn't mean you look at the GDP per capita compared to the US, oh, they're lower, they must be worse somehow. That simply wouldn't be the case. But the guns on the Berlin Wall pointed in one direction, right? So I think if we were going to evaluate societies, I think the best way to do it is just look at where people want to live, and it seems to me that the last 100 years of history have sort of proven that people don't want to live in communist societies. If you think they had to be communist because they were impending military threats, and so they had to rapidly industrialize or something, I think that's an empirical claim. I don't know if I'm qualified to speak on that, but it strikes me right now, right? I don't think there's anything if North Korea demilitarized, I don't think it's reasonable to think that they'd immediately be invaded or something, right?
Maybe.
Well, no, if what would be to whose advantage is it to invade North Korea?
whose advantage is it to invade Iran and Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan and so on and so forth? I mean, is it to Russia's advantage to invade Ukraine? I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, yeah, these are empirical claims, and neither of us have a crystal ball and have like we don't know what the exact likelihood. Like, okay, if North Korea lowered its military spending per GDP from, like, let's say it's at 10% now, which is astronomical because most countries it's around 2%. I think America's like 4%. But yeah, it's like 10%. And so if it lowered it to 90%, would that result in like an invasion next year? Um, maybe probably not. I mean, they probably have their own probabilistic models. I don't think the North Koreans are dumb. I mean, they have nuclear weapons. I guess maybe that's not a good point because some other countries have nuclear weapons that maybe, but they have a lot of people. So maybe if a country on average is fairly uneducated, but there's a billion people, then they're able to cobble together some pretty smart people. So I would just say, in general, if you have nuclear weapons as a country, you probably have a class of experts who are not like dumb fanatics on some level. And maybe those, I don't really know what goes on in North Korea. I don't know how much, like, the Kim family obviously is the public face of the regime and is able to execute. Same thing as Saddam Hussein. But, even in the case of Saddam Hussein or the Kim family, you always have, other people who necessarily have to make decisions because no matter how autocratic a regime is, you always have to delegate. And so, I'm confident that the North Koreans aren't doing things completely arbitrary. They have some model of, like, how much they should. Let's say they're spending 10%. Well, they're not spending 11%. And they're not spending 11% because they say, well, if we spent 11%, I guess that would decrease the likelihood of invasion, but it would also increase poverty and have all these other costs. And so, there's some, it's not market forces that are determining that like pricing essentially, but there is some kind of, I'm sure there's some kind of internal dialogue or discussion, unless, Kim Jong-il has just said, I determined that it's 10% because my ancestors told me I had a dream. It came to me in a dream. Yeah, maybe that's how it's happening. I don't know what's going on within that country. And I don't know what's going on in terms of, obviously, you have America has troops in South Korea. The South Koreans have their own ideas. Would they invade? Would they not invade? I don't know. And that question can be asked by a lot of different countries. It can be asked in Iran. Obviously, the Soviet Union was dealing with that question. It also didn't have, none of these countries have, like, purely pacifistic defensive ideas about national interest either. America doesn't have purely pacifistic. There's no country. Maybe Switzerland, or if you're a really small country, then you don't have that. But if you're a regional power, generally, countries want to expand. That's the natural tendency of pretty much all societies are either proxy states or colonies or protectorates, whatever term you want to use, or they're expansive. Those are basically the two types of states that exist. North Korea has this revanchist idea of uniting the Korean Peninsula. I'm sure the South Koreans would like to see that as well. Stalin had his own ideas. Hitler had his own ideas. We have our own ideas. So yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that the military is communist, and that argument isn't. The more accurate word is socialist, because communism has social aspects to it, or it has, if you're a communist, that means you believe in free love or something. So where I'm kind of getting this idea from is General Ludendorff was second in command of the German army during World War I, and after the war ended, he basically immediately wrote an 800-page two-part memoir where he described how he thought the German military lost because Germany wasn't socialist enough. And he thought that basically There should have been more state control of media. There should have been, more centralized organization of the economy. There shouldn't have been as much of a free market. There should have been more price controls and all of those things. And obviously, World War I was pretty devastating. But we could compare World War I to World War II, and we could say actually, like, the Germans got off pretty easy with World War I. In terms of, a million civilians, starved afterward. But still, like, the German economy was much better in 1919 than it was in, like, 1946. So Ludendorff is correct to say that with socialism, you could have achieved, like, higher percentage of GDP spending on military, and you could have maybe prolonged the war. Whether they could have won or not is a different question. But yeah, that's kind of my approach. The primary concern of a state is having to do with the military, and like more because of the evolution of warfare. More things are related to the military than were traditionally, because like. We don't fight with. It's not like we have a small warrior class of knights who fight with swords and armor, and like you can basically just ignore the other 99% of the population. Now it's like everyone is potentially could be drafted, and war. I mean, Ludendorff says this is war transformed from knights fighting on a field somewhere to it's a total war. It's a total society. Industrial, economized process where every single worker is essential to that process. So yeah, I guess that's my argument in defense of socialism. But yeah, we've gotten quite theoretical here.
Yeah, I don't know. It just strikes me like the U.S. military is doing pretty well, and the U.S. is not a socialist country. So, maybe you lose some aspect of national unity by renouncing socialism, but you become much more productive. So you push the technological frontier or whatever. I don't know. It just doesn't strike me as like a sufficient reason for like massively depressing your standard of living and like violating everybody's rights and everything.
Well, some libertarians would say we already are doing that.
Sure, yeah, but to a further extent, yeah. And I sort of have like a libertarian view on foreign policy where I don't think like expansion is like necessarily desirable, and like it just strikes me as basically I think every instance of military spending is not good, right? Like there's obviously like maybe some positive externalities where you gain some scientific stuff, right? But it would be best if no one could ever invade anyone.
Maybe maybe it would be best if death didn't exist and friction and violence and so on. But I guess given the world we have, I kind of look at this like I see these graphs of like supply and demand curves, and I see how like obviously businesses want to charge the maximum that they can charge, and then consumers want to pay the minimum that they can pay. So there's this constant negotiation where consumers are looking for cheaper prices and businesses are looking to charge higher prices, and there's competition. With states, there's much less competition because there are many less states. So it's really a negotiation between different parts of the population. Like obviously we have a military industrial complex that I'm sure if they could get away with it, 100% of GDP would just go toward the military, and we'd all be drafted, and it would just be, they would take over everything. Or at least that's their tendency, right? The tendency within the military. Like if you go to the military and you should say, okay, Mr. Five-Star General, should we spend more in the military or less? They're going to consistently tell you more. That's their interest. And then if you talk to, normal people of your sympathy, like the average American is kind of vaguely anti-war, not excited about foreign adventurism, feels like Vietnam was a failure, Iraq, Afghanistan. So kind of exhausted, don't see the point to it, don't see the national interest, and would prefer to say, you know what, obviously it's extreme libertarians or anarchists who would say we should abolish the military. But I think a lot of people have a vague sympathy toward, we could afford to decrease military spending by 1%. Why not? So it's a constant negotiation between different aspects of the state. And ostensibly in a democracy, you could say it's a conflict between the average ordinary person and the military industrial complex. So is there like an optimal percent of military spending? And I guess what I'm saying is I'm kind of using this word from an anarcho-capitalist or anarcho-libertarian perspective and saying that any military spending whatsoever is by definition coercive socialism. You are taxing people, you are taking their money, and you're using it, for foreign wars and things like that. So I'm accepting that we need some degree of socialism. Now, I guess the question, we're in 2024, there's a presidential election. The question is, should we have more socialism at this point in time or less? Like, there's always going to be a percent. Maybe some countries get away with spending 1% on their military. Some country, North Korea spends 10%. We're at 4%. Should we increase it to 5%? Should we decrease it to 3%? What can we get away with? What are our goals? What are our objectives? What's the ideal that we're going for? And you talked about how, people tend to migrate from communist countries. Like the wall only went one way. Like no one was fleeing West Germany to go to East Germany for the most part. It was East Germans fleeing to West Germany. But I would also say to you, in continuing with my earlier point, that after the Berlin Wall has fallen, and ostensibly, I think regionally, probably socialist parties win more in the East, and so you could argue that technically former East Germany has more socialist state-level policies or something. I'm not intimately aware with that. But even after the Berlin Wall has fallen, people have still tended to migrate there. I think Richard Hanania has done a little bit of analysis, probably others have too, on looking at or just pointing out the fact that people tend, within America, they tend to migrate away from California and New York and Illinois, which primarily we're talking about Chicago there, Cook County. They tend to migrate away from states that are Democrat-controlled, and they tend to migrate towards states that are Republican-controlled. So North and South Carolina, Florida, Texas. You could argue some of that's due to the weather and the invention of air conditioning, but you could also say that California has good weather too. So it's probably more likely that it has to do with economic policy. So I agree with you that if we just kind of democratically poll people, most of the time the default desire is for a society that's more beneficial to the consumer. And I think the argument you're making, and I think it's a fair argument, is that socialism probably isn't good for the individual consumer. Like socialism probably doesn't make the average median consumer wealthier, happier, get their stuff faster, whether you're talking about Amazon ships in 24 hours versus in the Soviet Union or East Germany, you wanted to get a television in the 80s and you had to it was a lottery and it would take you a month to get a response and so on and so forth. So I think you're right that from the perspective of the average person, they prefer to live in capitalist societies rather than socialist ones. I guess, be that as it may, which is not I don't think most socialists will ever make this argument, but be that as it may, I still think there's a degree of socialism that you need, because sometimes people need to be forced to have their stuff stolen and given to the state, because the state has a duty to maintain stability in a world that is chaotic, and it needs the resources to do that. The example I would give from the Bible is Joseph hoarding the grain. I'm sure the Egyptians didn't like the fact that Joseph was taxing them and stealing their grain, but then eventually you had a famine, and so they were happy that Joseph had stolen their grain because now they had these resources available in a time of crisis. So, I would point to that as like the primordial success case of socialism. But we are sort of we're getting near to the end of our time here. So I want to give you the last word on our discussion, and tell me
Sure.
where you think people should go, what people should read, and maybe if you're working on any articles, give us a preview of that.
Well, let me quickly respond to some of the stuff you said. So, I think maybe we're conflating socialism and just like, taxation because they're both coercive. Yeah, so socialism usually just means like worker ownership of the means of production. Non-socialist or like capitalist countries are obviously compatible with some taxation and stuff. And yeah, so technically, increasing military spending would be more coercive. But I think if you ask even like the most ardent ANCAP, like, would you abolish the government except we have 5% spending on national defense financed by like a consumption tax or something, and then no other, there are no other government laws or anything like that. I think everybody would accept that. Every ANCAP and libertarian would sort of
I did not accept that when I was an ANCAP, but continue.
Okay, sure. I mean, I'm not saying you would accept that as your utopia, but it's certainly like a big improvement, right? People are interested in that direction. And I think a lot of libertarians, national defense is like sort of the only thing that they can conceivably think of as like legitimate, like you could, legitimate uses of coercion. Um, yeah. And then in terms of like socialism, I don't know, it just strikes me. So first of all, like I like approach libertarianism first and foremost as like it's like just there's a more like people just start from a place of like self ownership and they have like rights to the property, their property and themselves. And so when you coerce them, there's a moral hill you have to climb there, I think. So like I'm not saying it's like totally impermissible to ever coerce somebody, right? But I think the presumption is always in favor of non-coercion. So I think if you're somebody who thinks like there's all these advantages to like state intervention, I think the onus is on you to show why the consequences of your favorite intervention are so great that it overwhelms the initial moral presumption to like self-ownership and natural rights. So that's sort of, and I'd love to go into more of that maybe next time or something like that. But that's sort of how I approach it. And yeah, so we've got a Substack. It's called Everything is Priced In. I just have the one article up now, but I'm working on maybe a series of articles that will sort of be like an introduction to finance theory. Sort of, it might be a little bit math heavy, but it's sort of aimed at smart people who have done like very limited economics or finance and sort of want to see like how people in the academic world are sort of thinking about these problems. And so that'll be like a series of articles that basically introduces like the entire theory of finance in maybe a few lectures or something like that.
Cool. Is there anyone else you want to shout out and suggest anybody you're reading or any? It doesn't have to be a Substack; could be a book or anything else.
Well, I'm a fan of Bentham's Bulldog on Substack. I know you just had him on. It was an interesting discussion. I like Richard Hanania, and I'm a fan of Marginal Revolution, Tyler Cowen's blog. It's not on Substack, but it's been running for a few years now. So I think those are good, interesting sources of analysis.
Okay, yeah, I will check that. I've heard of Tyler Cowen, but I haven't yet checked out his blog. So we'll post that in the notes. So we'll put a link up to that for people to check out. But yeah, I appreciate the discussion. Think it was. I appreciate your willingness for me to. We didn't have a structured plan. We just kind of went for it, and I think it was good.
All right, cool. Yeah, I don't know how it turned out, but we'll have to listen back and see. Yeah.
Okay. Philip, I appreciate you coming on, and I hope we can speak again soon.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care. Bye-bye. All right. So, guys, that was our little economics. Not really a debate. I kind of just presented why I mean, I think we sort of had a semantic disagreement on whether military spending is socialism. I mean, I was an anarcho-capitalist. I did believe that there was a libertarian argument against all state monopolies on violence. I believed in polycentric law. I believed that you could provide for national defense with private companies, with restrictive covenants, and that like nuclear weapons solved the problem of defense because you could just have like a micro state with one nuclear weapon, and if anyone invades you, then you just use your one nuclear weapon. And so the cost of invasion is so high that no one would ever invade anyone, and there would be no reason for warfare, and you wouldn't have to have standing armies, and you could provide, you would have policing with private contracted police officers, and so everything would basically be voluntary, and there would be no state coercion whatsoever. That was my ideal. And then over time, I started to change that opinion, and I basically said some mixture, some aspect of coercive government, and whether we call that socialism or not is not really, it doesn't really matter. But some of that is necessary. Now, having 100% of that probably is a problem because the state is imperfect, and so you're kind of making a very fragile system when you have 100% command economy because, as we talked about, people, that tends to have a lot of inefficiencies to it because of the problems of market calculation, and then people don't get their consumer goods, and then they flee to capitalist countries, and then you get brain drain, and so there's some problems with total communism. But I don't know. I think a little bit of socialism is okay, but we might disagree what percentage of socialism is good or bad. But, we'll figure it out. We have different opinions and we'll talk it out. So yeah, I thought it was a good kind of like because I think I talk a lot about social issues. I talk a lot about mythology and polarization. This was kind of more of a dry, economics. So people who like really dry, just the facts, sort of analytical discussions of economics. I made this episode for you. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, restack, all that stuff. Support me. You can sign up, become a paid subscriber. If you can't, I understand. Feel free to support me in those non-monetary ways. Boost me on the algorithm and all that good stuff. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.